All right, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to this Tech Strong Learning edition of AppSec Today, brought to you by Mend.io. My name is Cody, and I'd love to welcome you back to Tech Strong Learning, where we have an exciting presentation ahead. But before we get this panel underway, I do have a couple of housekeeping notes I'd like to review with you. First of all, today's session is being recorded. So if you miss any of our discussion, perhaps you'd like to rewatch at a later point in time, or of course you can share with your team. You will be receiving an email with a link to access the on-demand recording shortly after we conclude this live session. If you'd like to engage with us, there are a couple of options for you to do so. First option is the chat tab on the right side of your screen. So I'd like everyone that sees that chat tab to go ahead and test it out for us by letting us know from where in the world you are joining us. Now, if you have any specific questions for our panelists, we do want you to send those into the Q&A tab, as that helps us keep track of all of our questions, and we do want to try to answer as many as we can. So in advance, thank you so much for sending in those questions. I'll also note that at the end of our program today, we are giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, so be sure to stick around to make sure you're one of our lucky winners today. So our discussion today, our topic is SBOMs, a roadmap for secure software journey. And I'm joined by Daniel Bardenstein, CTO and co-founder at Manifest, Jeffrey Martin, Vice President, Product Management at Mend, Dimitri Raidman, CTO at Cybeats. We have Dr. Lisa Bradley, Senior Director of Product and Application Security at Dell Technologies. And keeping this train on the tracks today is our very own Mitch Ashley, CTO at TechStrong Group and Principal of TechStrong Research. So to our panel, thank you all so much for joining us today on Tech Strong Learning. Mitch, do you want to go ahead and get this conversation rolling?
Thank you very much, Cody. Appreciate you getting the plane off the ground in this hot weather. That's not always easy. So, wheels up. We are off and taking off and going. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. Very popular topic. A lot of interest, of course, around software supply chain security and SBOMs and a number of other things around how we kind of keep our software, whether it's development, creation, distribution, et cetera, secure with our own software and third party. Before we jump into that, I do want to add my thanks to Mend.io, who is our sponsor of the show. Mend sponsors AppSec Today, which is a thought leadership series around a number of engaging topics. Feel free to check out other past roundtables. And we appreciate the team there working with us, creating great topics and identifying folks that might appear. You'll notice we have folks from different companies, sometimes competing companies, and that's good. We like that engagement where we get some diversity of thought. And today we have a little bit of that practitioner, kind of a lot of things happening in our panel. So my thanks to the panelists for joining us here. We are going to do some introductions, and then I'll kind of kick off the topic. Daniel, would you start out with introducing yourself and then hand the baton to whoever you'd like to introduce themselves next?
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having us, Mitch and team. So I'm Daniel Bardenstein. Good to be with you all today. As Cody mentioned, I'm the CTO and co-founder of a company called Manifest. We develop an end-to-end SBOM management tool that helps security and procurement teams automate the entirety of the SBOM lifecycle, from generation to alerting, enforcement, sharing, etc. Before Manifest, I spent some time within the US government. I led tech strategy at CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Before that, spent some time with the Defense Digital Service within the Department of Defense, doing cybersecurity for the COVID vaccines and some other critical applications internally to DoD. And before that was over in Silicon Valley, building various enterprise security tools with a couple of different startups and tech companies out there. And I will pass the mic over to Lisa.
Hi, Lisa Bradley. I'm with Dell Technologies. I have the responsibility of our product security incident response team, PCERT. I also have the security champion and security training program. I run the bug bounty program. I have a customer security side where I help make sure that our customers have the transparency about our security practices. And then lastly, I'm responsible for the SBOM initiative for all of Dell.
And who would you like to have introduced next?
Let's go to Jeffrey.
Sure. Jeff Martin, like Cody said, I'm VP of Product over at Mend.io. We make SCA and SaaS software as well as the management communication around it. My own background Prior to that, I was in quality. Prior to that, healthcare. Really, it's risk management and the communication around risk management, which I think is the industry we're all in some way. And Dimitri, I think you're last but not least.
Right. Good afternoon and good morning, wherever you are. I'm Dimitri. I'm a co-founder and CTO of a company called Cybits. Cybits solves a problem of SBOM management and focusing specifically on solving problem of ingestion of SBOMs and analysis, continuous analysis of SBOMs for software producers and software consumers as both. And my background is in cybersecurity. I'm already over 20 years in cybersecurity, and going back to Israel, where I grew up most of my life. And mostly I dealt with application security and DevSecOps. That's my background.
Fantastic. A lot of experience here, practitioner in your backgrounds, as well as folks working with technology companies, maybe still being a practitioner today. I do want to add too, before we jump right into the topic, that the roundtable format that we have, yes, we have a panel here, and we will each be speaking about SBOMs and kind of roadmap to secure software journey. But we love when audience participants engage with us in the chat, and we feel free to ask questions, comment, add your own experiences, even comment. The panelists will be saying some things in chat. They'll be engaging with you and each other, as well as bring up topics and ideas, because we use that as a kind of guidance to help shape our conversation with our 50 minutes together that we have within the hour. And be sure to stick around. As Cody mentioned, we have a gift card to give away, 4 gift cards to give away at the end here. So let's jump to our topic. SBOM, software supply chain security, certainly 2 topics you hear a lot about. Maybe you've engaged in it. Maybe you're even doing some things in that aspect of your security programs. Maybe you're not. Maybe it's still kind of at that nascent starting point, trying to figure out what you should do. And if other folks have taken some steps ahead of you, maybe we can learn from each other and kind of share our lessons learned and mistakes we may have made along the way. So there also, of course, are a lot of regulatory pressures in the U.S. The presidential order around government purchase of software requiring SBOMs is just started to go into effect this summer with, I believe, the first phase of it. And of course, there are different regulations that kind of drive some of that behavior too. And oftentimes that's one of the things that is a catalyst for change. And it certainly oftentimes is in security. So let's do this. We said in our write-up when you registered for this roundtable, we're going to talk about creating sustainable software supply chain security strategy and realizing that people are in different points. Lisa, I thought I might start out with you, since you are actively engaged in this part of security, as well as some other things, bug bounties and other programs, about maybe how you introduced software supply chain and maybe specifically SBOMs into the security program that you work with at Dell.
Yeah, just making sure you could hear me okay.
Yes,
okay, great.
You sound great.
Thanks.
Sound great.
So I think with our secure development lifecycle practices, we always had the idea that teams need to have an inventory of their of what they consume, open source or third-party vendors. Where the SBOM initiative, what it did though through the executive order was sort of up our game. It turned it from a SDL type of ask to a regulatory type of ask. And therefore it got significant focus across the company and a little more, I would say, like organization, and also thinking about how to shift it left during the development cycle, and not just after the fact, here's my inventory and you're pulling things together. So for us, I always say, like, I have a love-hate relationship with SBOM. I'm really happy because it helped push the company, to really go that extra level with making sure that they're managing their inventory. But really, to me, SBOM is just one aspect, and the real focus, I always say, is really the dependency management, making sure that whatever you're consuming, you know about those vulnerabilities, and that you're keeping up your product code to make sure that you're best protecting your customers. So the focus for Dell especially is not just to have the SBOM, but to have a whole dependency management platform, so that we could feed in the SBOMs, we could generate the SBOMs, we could feed in the SBOMs, and then we could make sure that our product teams are aware of the vulnerabilities.
Jump in, panel. Who would ever like to go next?
Yeah, happy to jump in on that. Maybe starting off where at the beginning of Lisa's answer there, I think where a lot of organizations start off, there's kind of like similar to the 5 stages of grief, there's probably the 5 stages of SBOM skepticism, right? And it typically starts off in a couple different ways. But once you get past what is the SBOM, and we all point to our typical, it's the software ingredients list, it's Twinkies, the ingredients, nutrition label in the grocery store, etc. Then people end up asking, well, is this thing coming, right? We hear about this in the executive order, like you mentioned, Mitch, but I don't sell to government. So, is this something that even applies to me? Or we've spoken with a lot of folks that even do work with the US government and also in the EU with some of the regulation that's happening there. And there's some skepticism about, the execution of the SBOM program writ large. And I think if there's maybe a good place we can start off this conversation is that, to quote Game of Thrones, SBOMs are coming. The SBOMs are certainly coming. There are carrots and there are sticks, right? So we've talked about the sticks within the US. The executive order has now morphed into a memo from OMB that sooner or later all federal agencies, I think by the end of this year, a little bit sooner than that, will require secure software attestations and SBOMs from companies that sell software. The CRA, the Cyber Resilience Act in Europe, will make sure that companies providing software in Europe will need to be able to furnish SBOM. So there's a whole host of regulations that are coming. We see this in finance, healthcare, etc. But there are also carrots. NSA and CISA have put out guidance that SBOMs are part of a healthy breakfast, so to speak, of secure software development. Same with the secure software development framework within NIST. I know I'm sounding very government-y right now. It's because I spent a couple of years there. But we've also spoke with a number of customers that just see SBOMs, as Lisa mentioned, as a new tool to get transparency into dependency management, into faster vulnerability management, into better procurement. And so I think organizations that might be on the call that are listening about, getting their feet started with SBOMs really have to ask themselves the question, do we want to lean forward into SBOMs to be a little bit more proactive and develop a stronger internal security posture? Or are we going to wait until the sticks of regulation come and force us to do this, and we're going to have to scramble to meet a deadline, which we've also seen with some partners of ours. And it's never fun to try to build a whole program, especially for a government regulator in a very short timeline. So maybe that's where I'll start and pause there if others want to jump in.
Yeah, maybe I'll pick it up because, look, SBOMs are an output of an actual process. They are not necessarily the whole process by themselves. Lisa picked it up beautifully. Really what this is supply chain management, and the SBOM is how you communicate to stakeholders what you've done with your supply chain. So if you focus only on generating the output, well, it's called the bill of materials because we stole it from manufacturing. When you buy something and it has the bill of materials and it says what's in it, that's great, but the manufacturer certainly doesn't want to say 13 rusty nails and, or whatever other horrible manufacturing analogy I can come up with. You want to have your dependencies managed, your supply chain good, so that when you communicate it via an SBOM, you're communicating the value of your product, the value of your company. You're not just giving them a list of everything that is wrong with your application or company. So an SBOM, I think the best way to think of it is an output of a good dependency health and supply chain management process. And if you start from the kind of beginning, how do I manage what goes into my product? How am I making sure that that is secure, good quality, all the other things that constitute dependency health up to date? Your SBOM will actually be the easiest part because it's just a list of all the stuff that's in there.
You know, Dimitri, some of our audience has commented and asked about, we've used terms like dependency management and kind of platform engineering, number of different terms. You know, and I actually just posted right before Jeff mentioned that SBOMs are really an outcome, right? There's something that you produce that shows the work that you may or may not have put into kind of managing your software. How do you kind of tease apart SBOM versus the things that come before it to help you get to a place where you're producing quality information, not just showing how bad your software is managed?
That's that's a great question, and well, in my opinion, if you were able to produce an SBOM, it already indicates and attestates your maturity from the perspective of, it means that you have CI/CD process. You have ability to perform repeatable build. You have the ability to perform a SCA analysis of your software and understand your dependencies, like collect this information. So just by having the ability to provide the SBOM, it indicates a lot about your organization, and really it's all about maturity. And I would say like it really drives the transparency, right? It shows that, hey, I'm ready to be transparent. And usually people who are ready to be transparent means, it means like it's in your house. If your house is clean, you're not concerned to invite people, etc. Right? And that's the same thing. That's what it shows, right? It shows, hey, like we have this under control. We are monitoring everything. We look at everything. We are ready to be transparent. We're ready to show, the ingredients of the sauce we building here. And here you go, customer. I'm also open to the fact that, you will be aware of any risks that imposing, or affecting the software that I'm selling to you at the same time as I will be aware of them, right? Because once you share your SBOMs, your customers can do something with these SBOMs. There's like no point just sharing the SBOMs for the sake of sharing them, right? What you're going to do with them? You really need to put them at work. And that's kind of where the management part of the SBOMs comes in place. And that's really what, the industry hopes to get. If we would put aside for a second the regulatory requirements, right? And one of the items that actually I want to add to what Daniel said before is the National Cybersecurity Strategy Implementation Plan, right? The pillar 3 there is clearly focuses on the SBOMs and the transparency, right? And there's many different values that you can get, I would say, from the SBOM. It's not just about, hey, you have vulnerabilities because you're using Log4j, right? One of the things that I think are very important there is also the knowledge about end of life or end of support of certain software components, right? If I'm selling to someone a product and I'm buying a product, I want to make sure that my vendor is not using an operating system that is outdated for the last 7 years, right? Because how he's going to support me if I have a problem, if he's not getting support from the operating system, from the organization that stands behind the operating system or any other infrastructural component, right? So there is a lot of things that we need to think about when we're talking about or answering such questions.
And I love to quickly piggyback on something Dimitri just said, which is, I forget the exact phrase, I think it was like, you need to put the SBOMs to work. And I know Dimitri and I think very similarly about SBOMs. Another way to think about this is, especially given the nexus to the government and pushing, the broader SBOM adoption, there's been a perception that SBOMs are just kind of another compliance checkbox, right? Something I need to do, and then I'm done, and I don't need to worry about it. We found a lot of value, and that's also why we started Manifest, thinking of an SBOM like a piece of data, right? And like any other piece of data, the data is only as valuable as what you do with it. So when you aggregate it, when you normalize it, when you enrich it with other data, when you analyze it, when you add a layer of automation, you can actually meaningfully make an impact on reducing your enterprise risk. So I think going off of what Dimitri was saying, helpful for people to think about SBOMs not just as this requirements checklist that someone else is going to make you do, but it's really a piece of data that you can use either if you're developing software, if you're internal applications or tools, or especially for pretty much everyone probably listening that buys software, knowing what's actually in the stuff you're about to buy and put in, deploy in your production network or put in data for processing, put in PII, PHI, other regulated data. And so, there's a mindset change of thinking about is how can you use this data to help reduce your risk rather than check a checkbox.
I'm going to pick up on that for a second. We talk a lot about SBOMs because most of the people we talk to, I think as a panel, we're more concerned about generating an SBOM and providing it to people as an output. But the fact of the matter is it's also an input, at least in a very mature organization. So that, Daniel said it beautifully. The process is what matters. The output is certainly your proof. But when you think about supply chain management as a whole, I'll go back to the manufacturer analogy. I used to work in medical devices. Every part I got had a nice, clean bill of materials so that I could take it and put it into my bill of materials for when I shipped. And that is just as an important of use of SBOMs as an input as output.
Yeah, I do wonder about the complexities with it. Certainly, if you didn't listen to any commercials, you wouldn't know that we used Intel, right? So having Intel's SBOM makes sense, so that we could understand quickly if when there's a new vulnerability, for example, in an open source space, if we know that Intel's affected and we'll need to do something about it. But the chain of the chain of the chain of the chain can be, a lot. If we consume Intel and Intel consumes something else and that consumes something else, and even the open source themselves consume each other. So, the hierarchy there, I feel that we probably still haven't figured out how to deal with. That right now we are on the first layer of the ingredients, which is fine. It's a good step. But I think we saw with, for example, Log4j and that the latest hottest issue that we had, that you thought maybe you patched it with yourself and then one of your vendors, and then you realized that there was one of the vendors something had something, and then you had to go and update again. So that chain reaction was a lot.
It's an interesting point, because SBOM sort of appeared on the scene as the thing, right, for software supply chain management. Gets a lot of conversation, but it's really a mature life cycle of understanding the code you're using, your software you're using, code that you're developing, et cetera. But then how you act upon it now that you have that knowledge, right? Managing vulnerability programs, whether it's in yours or third-party software, open source, all of that kind of thing. So it's not just the action of producing an outcome like an SBOM. It's knowing that, how do you use that to improve the security, quality, et cetera, and be able to respond when there are incidents to that process. I'm curious, Lisa, if you think back to kind of when you introduced the idea of SBOMs, what things did you already have in place that made it easier to adopt, or that you needed to kind of maybe beef up or shore up to be able to make that a valuable process?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, the responsibility of what you consume is on the product team. I think, they have to be paying attention to the vulnerabilities, to open source, whatever they're consuming. But I think what the security team, at least in Dell, is trying to do is trying to help support that. So, scanning tools, SCA tools, having that, make sure that we have good relationships with our vendors. So I keep mentioning Intel, but our PCert to PCert, we often interlock and have that relationship. Having contractual obligations on our vendors is also important to make sure that they do have SDL practices, that they will have an SBOM if they don't already, that they do have a vulnerability response program and SLOs on them typically also. So there's so many different aspects that were already existing. And like I said, our SDL practices said you had to have an inventory. You have to maintain your software. This is just, like I said, kicking it up just another notch. And it's also sort of making sure that everyone's actually adhering to it, because, there's a difference of us checking and doing the checklist versus a regulatory ask doing a checklist on us, because the attestations that are coming out are really intense right now.
And continuing off of Lisa's thread, I think typically SBOMs are spoken about in that what we think about as like the first party use case, like how do I generate SBOMs from my internal code and applications? But the third party and procurement use case, I think, is a very compelling one that started to get more airtime, but isn't discussed as much. And we've seen already like some great successes with using SBOMs in that realm. And just some very quick anecdotes, very succinctly, we've worked with several organizations to generate the contract language that goes in their third-party, software evaluation contracts, when they provide SBOMs, the formats, when, what should be included, and just that process of during software evaluations, being able to get SBOMs from different vendors, put them in a particular tool, or have some sort of easier human-readable way to understand what is the risk of this software that I want to buy or I'm trying to evaluate, in a way that even a non-technical procurement person can understand. Using that to actually negotiate back with the vendors. And we've actually seen this happen a couple of times very successfully where, a customer gets an SBOM from a potential vendor, they throw it into the tool, it lights up like a Christmas tree, there's lots of vulnerabilities and license issues. You'd expect them, the third party, to have known, but they weren't. And then you can have this conversation about, we like the tool, but we're not willing to accept this amount of risk deploying into our production environment. And then seeing the vendor turn around, wanting to close the deal, and actually go, reduce some code bloat, reduce some vulnerabilities, and then come back with an updated version of the software, a cleaner SBOM that gets validated. And then, the contract gets signed, the pilot is done, doesn't really add much time. And now not only has the organization reduced the risk of software that they're about to deploy in their environment, they have the SBOM, they've now added to their third-party dependency management system automatically. So as my co-founder likes to joke, when log5 shell happens, they'll be better prepared and know which third-party vendors to go yell at. And I think something to not forget about as well, now this vendor company that had this insecure software now has more secure software for all of their customers. So there's kind of a positive externality here, right? This one interaction has now made software more secure for everyone else. And I think ultimately as an industry, that's where we want to get to, right? We don't just want to improve security one by one. We want to do the things that will raise the tide for everyone.
Yeah, and I think in the chat there was a question about how do I come at this from a requirements management perspective? I think you probably just heard the word contract 6 or 7 times in that. This, as a product professional, this isn't something you can just assume happens. It has to be part of your product requirements. It has to be communicated to your team. There's other non-functional requirements, the famous one, I guess, is quality, where you're just like, oh, by the way, everything also needs to work. But this is a lot more explicit. It's closer to, we need to be compliant with X standard, PCI, because we're an application that handles credit card. It's basically now a requirement for all software that you are able to say what's in the software. And if you're able to say what's in the software, you better make sure that what you say reflects well on your company. These are just requirements for doing business. It's like when cars came out in the 20th century, the first half of the 20th century, you could build a car in your garage and sell it to your neighbor. And then the NTIA came along and all these regulations, and suddenly, no, if you want to sell a car, you have to meet all these requirements. This is that requirement. It's still in the early stages of being adopted and enforced, but it's not going to take very long.
It does shine a light. I'm thinking about, so I like the analogy of once the car leaves the manufacturing line, we don't say, oh, now how do we add airbags to that? That's kind of the wrong time. That's sort of what an SBOM does, to say, by the way, you're missing a bunch of stuff here if you don't have that process built in. So to your point, Jeff, it starts with requirements. There's also the process side of it and automating. There's a lot of questions about tools. And some of you represent companies that provide technology in these areas. Love to hear sort of what are the things to consider when you're looking for tools or technology to build into your DevOps workflow pipeline or other tool sets. Any considerations? Jeff, do you want to start out there?
Sure. Automation, and then follow that with some more automation, and then a little bit more automation. these things do not work manually or even partially automated. SBOM generation, SCA, correlation to vulnerabilities, all of that has to be automated. It's, to use your car analogy, it's a little worse than actually a car manufacturer. At least when you make a car and it leaves the factory, the parts all stay the same. For a software, all of the parts are constantly changing as you drive down the road. And ultimately, if you don't have something automated doing all of that, the best you can do is really surface level. I'm sure Lisa would second that, being an actual practitioner doing it. Like, can you imagine if you had to hire a whole bunch of people to do all that?
I mean, it was very, I would say it's very painful. We took a product set and did our first initial SBOMs, and the amount of manual work was huge, even though we have some tooling, but our, tooling is just starting to catch up to where we really need it to be, and it still has a lot of room to grow. I think for us, yes, automation is a key thing. Being able to shift left and put it within our, our developer platforms in the beginning is another thing. I think, I know Alan Friedman quite well, and him and I were talking one time, and he was like, "Yeah, you just push a button," and I'm like, "No, you can't just push a button. Like, it's not that easy. Like, it doesn't happen that easy. It's very difficult. There's a lot of work behind it, and to upkeep it too. You have to think, like, every time we make any update to a release, we have to regenerate a new SBOM. So there's so much to go and think about the tooling, but then there's also thinking about the storage and how do we make sure we give it to customers, which customers do we even give it to. There's so much behind this picture and thought process that needs to happen in order to be successful. And I think it's very easy, especially for regulatory people who are not sitting in the vendor space, to know how to what the work is behind this. Just you can't imagine.
I was going to jump in, but Dimitri, yeah, go ahead.
Yes, Dimitri, jump in. We haven't heard from you in a bit.
Yeah. So it's very great points, but about the tooling and how to generate. Based on today's situation, the generation of SBOMs really became a commodity, right? It's only a question of really understanding what is the right tool for your use, right? Of course, it would be different if you're developing microservices, containers, devices, as a firmware or traditional software, right? You would use different tools. Where to find or understand these tools and how they align with your process, right? I mean, there is great analysts, companies that would, do their hype cycle. And I think recently there was one from Gartner about application security, open source software, and others. And the thing is that some tools are good for certain technology or stack, and other better for different thing. And what I want to say is that when you're using tools, it's very important to look at the transitive dependencies, right? So when you're generating SBOMs, for example, as part of your process, and the tool you're choosing, it should support a transitive dependencies, right? So because you want to understand the layers of the software, how one little library is encapsulated in others, and then kind of reaches your software. It will help you in the future specifically with the VEX and the automation of that work, and make it much more easier for you. Another aspect of tools and the process that you have in place is you need to watch the SBOM quality, right? SBOM quality is very important, and the quality has many aspects. Sybase is actually the first company in the market that came up with SBOM quality measure capability, right? So it kind of tells you, hey, how good is your SBOM, and gives grade. And what's very important there, right, is not just to pay attention to the structure of the SBOM. Hey, that's kind of simple to validate, but it really is to pay attention to how every item in the SBOM classified, right? So you don't classify, as example, a library or package as application, right? Because it's incorrect to have wrong hierarchy, etc., or you classify it as a device, right? And there's like also the complexity of different languages of SBOM, right? And I'm intentionally saying languages and not formats, because that's what they are, cyclonix and SPDX, right? And of course, there's all of this selection, all of this evaluation. So you first need to understand what's your goals, right? You want to quantify them. You want to understand very clearly what you want to achieve, and then you need to go and find the right tool, the right technology for your purpose. One of the things that I want to bring up is actually in Sybase, our teams are continuously evaluating open source tools to generate SBOMs on the market, and we created a GitHub repository that actually has this list. So for the public and the community to use, I welcome you to have a look there.
I'm happy to jump in. We're also we were advised that we don't necessarily want to all agree, so I'll try to add in a couple of slightly against the grain points here. So in terms of things to consider, I mean, I think ultimately SBOMs, and let's talk a little bit about SBOM generation and overall management. I think in order to succeed, they must be fully automated, and I think they must get to the point where it can be one click, to to the remark that Lisa made. And I think we've actually seen that it can be that simple. It doesn't, we've seen the manual effort and it's painful, but we have developed capabilities for like generating SBOM for people we've worked with. That's literally taken 30 seconds, right? They have a GitHub repository, integrate with it, they can generate SBOM, etc. So slightly, it's not that much of a hot take, but I think we're starting to get there, which is encouraging. And I think we have to. And zooming back, and I know there's a question about VEX and VDR, which I'd love to circle back on. These concepts are all machine readable JSON, right? They're not meant for humans to look at, to read, to manually interact with. The whole idea of these things being machine readable is that they're good for machines to communicate and to parse very quickly, which leads itself to automation. And how do we distill that information into a very readable summary for a human who's very busy, who has lots of other stuff going on, to make very quick, informed decisions on whether to let a build pass or whether to buy a piece of software, et cetera, et cetera. And then I'll quickly touch on quality, which Dimitri mentioned as well. And again, both agree, disagree a little bit. SBOM quality, certainly important, certainly has, there's a lot of nuance to that discussion right now, right? There are a lot of open source generators out there. There are a lot of generators out there. They're not all created equal, right? And we've also done some research on which environments, which languages, which ecosystems some of these generators work on better than others. But I think a very important message that I think that everyone should remember going forward on this: we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good here when it comes to software transparency. Right now, we're operating as an industry still closer to the zero side of transparency of what is in this software that I'm buying and deploying in my internal network. This initial wave of SBOM generation tools, they're not going to be perfect. They're not going to have full dependency trees. They're not going to grab every single, they might have a little bit of false positives depending on when you scan them, right? There are different times you can generate SBOMs in the pipeline, whether from source or build or runtime. You'll get different SBOMs, which leads to different analyses. So I think it's important for everyone to have that expectation that this is continuing to evolve and continuing to improve, especially for ourselves, who company tries to kind of handle this whole end-to-end life cycle. But knowing that we can't let some transparency is still better than no transparency. And I think as an industry, we're still working to improve that. And I mean, Mitch, if it's okay with you, I know there's a question that's been sitting on there for a while about VEX and VDR, and I know Lisa jumped on that. So perhaps we can pivot there, and then I can start off. We can go around the circle on VEX and VDR.
Yeah, go for it.
I guess a quick 10-second explainer for those who aren't familiar with all the alphabet soup in this space, because there's plenty of it. VDR, the Vulnerability Disclosure Report, another piece of JSON that technically, at least according to the definitions I have, it's supposed to be the companion piece to an SBOM, right? So an SBOM tells you what's in the thing, the ingredients, and the VDR also comes from the software manufacturer, and it says, we've attested to knowing what's in these ingredients and where vulnerabilities are, and we confirmed that these vulnerabilities, like, you shouldn't worry about these, right? Maybe they're just lows and mediums, right? So it's an attestation from me as a vendor that there's not going to be zero vulnerabilities in our software, but the ones that are in there, they're not reachable, they're less critical, or maybe here are the mitigating factors, right? So it's supposed to be a companion. Whereas VEX, the Vulnerability Exploitability Exchange, another piece of JSON, and that's meant to communicate exploitability and impact of vulnerabilities to your customers. So I'll pick on Lisa for a sec. If there's a new vulnerability that comes out in a piece of Dell hardware or software, how does Lisa's team most effectively in an automated way communicate to all their customers, like, here are the versions of Dell stuff that are impacted, here are the ones that aren't impacted. If they are, when's the fix coming? If not, here's what you need to, here are the actions you need to take. So that's a very succinct, dirty version of Vex and VDR. There's lots of stuff you can Google on them. So to answer really quick and then pass around the horn for responses, we've also seen this stuff starting to take off slowly but surely, more on the Vex side than the VDR. So people seem to be more interested in, when there's a new vulnerability disclosed, how do I quickly and automatedly tell all of my downstream customers what they need to worry about and what not. It also makes it easier for me when regulators or auditors come and ask, are you impacted by Log4 Shell or this vulnerability? I can have my bill of health that says we looked at this, we attested to this, et cetera, et cetera. But there are some caveats, and that even though this is still relatively early on in the life of Vex, there are already 3 or 4 different formats, and they already disagree on what should be in a Vex file. And there's already some contention in this field. So there's no one standard, there's no right standard, but there, I think, and let's zoom out way big. Why are we doing this in the first place, right? Adversaries in cyberspace use automation to find and exploit vulnerabilities very, very quickly, right? And so adversaries have for a long time had the upper hand on defenders. And so defenders need to leverage more into automation to find vulnerabilities, to identify impacted assets, to triage them, to defend them. And Vex and VDR are kind of one big step in that direction, right? So the whole reason we're doing this in the first place as an industry is to try to get the defenders on par with the attackers in terms of use of automation. Hopefully we can help defend our assets faster than adversaries can find and exploit the vulnerable ones.
Good question about vulnerability. There's a lot of questions about the vulnerabilities, and one is about, does the SBOM define the CVE or CPE? That's really defined externally as referenced, right? The software has this particular CVE. I think the theme of a lot of the conversation going on in chat right now is, it isn't a point in time. It isn't the day you sign the contract that you get the SBOM and these other documents, right? Because as you mentioned, Jeff, the car to go driving down the road is changing maybe every day, right? So with every change in the software that you're using, and imagine all the sources that you're getting from that, is updated information through these document vehicles, these JSON files. How do you manage that? Because any significant piece of software is going to have a lot of sources, whether internal or external. Jeff, I'd love your thoughts on that.
I might be a little controversial. I actually think Vex as a static file is a bad idea. I think what it really needs to be is a feed, a data feed. And
like an
that
RSS feed.
Yeah, and I know we're not there yet as an industry, but that's really what it is. The fact of the matter is, if you're a reasonable size software company, you are constantly updating things. You're constantly updating your inventory. New vulnerabilities get discovered, so there goes Vex. The Vex that you ship today is gone tomorrow. Your mitigations change daily. The environments that you run your application in, if you're a SaaS vendor, for example, where you deploy it, that changes. To Daniel's point, the best we can't automate everything right now. The best we can do is automate a point in time. And even that is hard with the current tooling. It's very hard. But I do think longer term, this stuff stops being static files being passed around and starts being a data feed. Slack over email, right? Or instead of email, I should say. That's just the future. So I do think, all these fun conversations we have between all the different Vex and VDR standards and who wants what in which SBOM format. Ultimately, if you flash forward 5 to 10 years, we're looking at data feeds, not static files.
Yeah, we're focusing on API calls to know it, and not static files and within Dell, just for that matter, because we would have files all over the place, right? And that would just be a nightmare, especially because, as we've been talking in the chat, that it goes through stages, right? With Vex, it starts off as you're under investigation. then you're either, not affected or affected. And then you go into, if you are affected, you hopefully go into the fixed state at some point. And when you get to that fixed state, you typically have in a traditional PCERT framework, and you following through it, you have your comms, which is a security advisory or a security bulletin to indicate what vulnerabilities were addressed, and where to get that update for it. So I think what's interesting about, and this is what we talk within our team, what's interesting about VEX is that we're taking our typical PCERT framework, where we go from, discovery, triage, and analysis, putting a remediation plan together, remediating, and then disclosing, and we're figuring out where does VEX fit in into it. So, as soon as you open up, say, the ticket, you discovered that potential vulnerability, you would say under investigation. As soon as you do your impact statement, you would change over to not affected or affected. And then lastly, when you disclose and you publish your remediation, then you would go into fix. But that journey sounds really easy, but it's a lot of integration, and we all are talking about automation. So how do we automate it? If you have a vulnerability management type of tool that you're utilizing, you want to integrate into it so that when that impact statement is switched to yes, I'm affected, or no, I'm not, right? That is automatically fed into some format of a document or whatever in the background, and then an API call could be called from a customer to know the impact statement and if we're affected. So there's a lot to go into it. I think the nice thing with VEX right now is that there's a lot of discussions. There's a lot of industry collaboration. I posted in the chat. There's a VEX summit just this week on Thursday that Cisco's hosting. I certainly will be there. Luckily, it's in my backyard. Pretty much. But I think there's still a lot of discussion, there's still a lot of growth, and it's not an official mandate yet from anybody. It's just going along with SBOM to make the SBOM make a little more sense, because the SBOM is just a file, and like you said earlier, Jeff, like if you can't figure out how to even consume that, right, and know how to utilize it from if I'm a customer and I'm getting it from my vendor, I wouldn't know what to do. So there's a reason why we're talking about VEX also, is because it's really going to shed a light of the importance, and also it's going to bring the reality of what an SBOM could be very scary, because if you say that you use OpenSSL, for example, and there's new vulnerability in OpenSSL, as a customer, you might assume that you're automatically affected, when in reality you might not be affected. And so that not affected, that is really key. And it's been a growth that we've seen in the industry and with a lot of our customers being able to accept the fact that there are some mitigating factors, which means we might not be vulnerable to that issue.
It's funny, and I'll make a comment just based on something that was in the chat. Everybody has a big hunger for official standards and official guidance. And the fact of the matter is there isn't even an official, never mind any actual strong guidance. What we have is a loose conglomeration of vendors who are making contractual obligations with each other, coalescing around some standards. But the fact of the matter is there's no judge here. The judge is the marketplace. And I think personally, eventually, assuming our politics get out of the way eventually, we will end up having something the equivalent of the FDA for medical devices, or the NTIA for cars, right? Or the FAA for planes. We will have real rules, probably country-based, that say and they will evolve out of the standards. But right now, everybody keeps asking, like, what is it I have to do? And the answer is what your customers need you to do, not a government organization. The closest we've gotten is some very loose, pretty weak guidance, actually, about how the federal government will purchase software. And even that is really still just a customer, not all customers. So I don't know. I just see in the chat a lot of people looking for more like, here's exactly what you need to do. And the answer is that's still moving. It's not what I would consider official.
And I think that the regulatory landscape will continue to evolve, to your point, Jeff. I mean, you have the Cyber Resilience Act in the EU, right, that started in 2022, and there's something else coming up. I can't remember what it is.
FDA is coming up, is a very clear requirements. So
I think in that way, we'll probably have different sources of different, we will, right? Regulatory frameworks and things that are going to be localized, different countries, et cetera. So, and Dimitri, I apologize for stepping on your response there. We have about 10 minutes left. Everybody be sure and hang around because we're going to be giving away those gift cards. Want to make sure you're available for that. Let's do this for wrap up. One of the things we said we would talk about in our description of the roundtable today was how do you keep up on all that's happening, right? How do you stay current with not only SBOMs, but, VDRs and VACs and technologies that support them, as well as regulations. I know there's probably not one source that will answer all questions other than maybe Googling it, and with a lot of work trying to figure it out. I'm curious, maybe Dimitri, if you want to start us out with your thoughts on how do you keep up on what's happening in the industry around software supply chain dependency, and software decomposition, all of these different ways of reporting that information and providing that information with SBOMs and more.
Of course, Mitch. So SBOM are, or maybe like supply chain security is not just SBOMs. There's many initiatives on the market, right? And by the way, if you want some insight, you're welcome to ask me on LinkedIn if you want. I'm happy to guide you to some groups and some sources for information. But overall, I have some list that I prepared, which is, one of the things that I would do is following White House publications on the topic, right? I mean, that's kind of the high level strategy. Following NIST, secure software development framework. That's another one. Joining SBOM groups. There is one SBOM group on LinkedIn. There is also following the SBOM page on LinkedIn. That's where there's a lot of information. Joining CISA working groups. There's 5 groups right now, which you can just ask. Anyone can ask and join and contribute there from your knowledge and your expertise. There's VEX, open VEX groups as well. Attending conferences, there is a good one about VEX, I think in the next 2 weeks. And Salsa by Google, another thing that's been promoted in the industry, very interesting to follow. Following SPDX, CycloneDX, languages following DBOM projects and many other Linux Foundation or OWASP projects that surrounding this area. As one of the things that helps me to actually get grasp of everything going on, there is a lot, is setting up Google alerts for these keywords and topics. And, then I'm getting my feed in the morning and I'm reading it. So I think that's one of the great ways of keeping up.
Great. And if you have sources, feel free to post them in chat, both panelists and audience. Daniel, you want to go next?
Yeah, I mean, there's not much I can add on top of what Dimitri mentioned because I do all the same things, but I will say it can very easily become a full-time job, 40 hours a week, just to catch up and read all the documents and material, all the LinkedIn posts, all the Thinkfluencers about SBOMs, all the working groups. They are infinite. And so my caution to the folks on the call, because there's constantly evolving updates, new format specs, this regulation, this company's use case, is just try to identify the high value signals on where exciting or novel content is coming from for people you trust and focus there. Because otherwise, if I just dedicated my time to reading every single Google alert and every single working group, I wouldn't have any time to do any actual work. So that's my one piece of advice. And the other thing I would mention, because I think there are a lot of, it's a hot topic. There's a lot of people who just post on LinkedIn or other sources about here's what we're doing, etc. Talk to your communities, right? We see a lot of good uptick on like local B-sides conferences or DevSecOps events. Chatting with other people in your immediate network or locale and how they're using SBOMs, trading stories, what tools work. It's probably the highest signal one can get, because otherwise just trying to sift through the fire hose of information that's on the internet about this stuff is a pretty daunting task.
Yeah, maybe let me riff off of that for a second, because look, I come at this like a product person. I'm not an engineer, I'm a product person. And fundamentally, as we kind of talked about a few times, this is something that's customer driven. This is people buying your software. If you can do nothing else, you have to at least talk to your customers and ask them what they want and what they care about, which hopefully you're doing for your product anyways. But fundamentally, SBOM requirements come from your customers, whether it's the federal government or Dell or anybody else. You need to meet your customers' needs. That should be your number one source for what you need to do. Everything else is really important, keeping aware. But like Daniel said, at the end of the day, we all have a job to do. And in application development, unless we're writing open source, our job is to get money from customers in some way or another. So listening to them is the best signal for what's important.
Lisa, we'll have you bring it home here.
Yeah, I'm going to take a different angle here because there was a lot of great resources on how to keep up with it. But I'm going to take the angle of if you're just starting out, make sure you have SDL and vulnerability response practices. Make sure you have a way that researchers can report issues. Let's just start with the basics. I know SBOM and all that are a significant amount of work, but if you really want to know what your customers need, they need you to make sure that you are having the best secure code out there and that you are making sure that you're addressing your vulnerabilities. So if you're not to the maturity level of generating SBOMs yet, that's okay. Make sure you get the basics down and do them well. And then you could go on to the next level of maturity, which is having the SBOMs and giving them to your customers and VEX and all that. So there's tons of resources on making sure that you have secure software. And I'm a big fan of First PCERT Services Framework. I helped write it. So of course I like it. But if you have any questions about even the basics of starting up, please, you could reach out to me too.
Fantastic. Just a final comment before we hand things back to Cody. It's weaved in this is the idea that this is actually a two-way process, bidirectional, right? It's what you receive from the people or the sources of software that you're using as part of your software, and then also externally, the people that are buying or using what you produce. And so there's a learning both ways, right? And part of this, the learning is actually just by getting started and then engaging with who's receiving what you're producing and also what you're receiving on incoming in. So I think the best practice is don't just rush out and buy 8 tools and that'll solve all your problems. It's a big learning process. And yes, there are tools and technology that'll fit into your workflow and your tool chain. But honestly, those sources of the technology vendors are also a great source of understanding about how you do this, so they can help you as well. You want to comment
Mitch,
on that, Jeff?
I completely forgot to mention one of the most important sources, which is TechStrong.
Oh,
I can't believe I forgot to mention that one.
Well, it's a little self-serving for me to say it, but I've been self-serving in the past. Yeah, definitely keep on. We talk about this a lot, and it's just this conversation alone is a great example of how we kind of got into VEX and VDR and a bunch of different things that we haven't really talked about on some prior roundtables and webinars and things. So the conversation is evolving as well. So I'm going to hand things back to Cody, and I just want to thank our panelists today, Lisa, Jeff, Daniel, and Dimitri, for your time. Audience, you've been fantastic. The conversation, the dialogue we've had in chat in parallel with our panel has been really rich and fantastic. And you've made this, you've upped the game of what we've been doing here significantly. So thank you to everyone there. Cody, back to you.
Awesome. Mitch, thank you. And Dimitri, Daniel, Jeff, and Lisa, thank you all so much for joining us as well on TechStrong Learning. It was such a pleasure getting to speak with you before and hearing all of your insights over this last hour. So once again, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
So I'd like to remind our audience that the session was recorded. You will be receiving an email with a link to access the recording on demand, or of course, you can find it living on Security Boulevard at securityboulevard.com/webinars. And be sure to look in the on-demand section where it will be there for you shortly to wait for you. The 4 winners of our $25 Amazon gift card drawing are Katie N, Ciro M, Shital P, and Kendra M. So to our 4 winners, congratulations. Keep an eye on your email inbox to claim your gift card. We'll communicate with you in the next 48 hours on how to claim that gift card. But if you don't happen to see communications from us, check your spam folder on the off case that it got filtered out. I'd like to thank Mend.io for sponsoring our program. I'd like to thank once again our speakers for being here. And to our audience, thank you so much for your input with the chat, with your questions, and for being here for the duration of our program today. So once again, thank you everyone for being here. We really appreciate you stopping in on TechStrong Learning, and we hope to see you at a future learning experience. Have a great rest of your day, and you may now disconnect.